Hello, my name is Sandy Fivecoat, and I will be your host. In this video, we will be discussing the Common Core and the performance gap in literacy and different strategies, tips, and resources that you might use to help your students. We're really excited today because joining me in this discussion is Pam Allyn, who is the Executive Director and founder of LitWorld. Now, Pam is an authority in the field of literacy education and the world's expert in home and school community literacy connection. Let's talk about the most important parts of the literacy standards inside the Common Core state standards. Can you talk a little bit about that?
The standards are really valuing the art of speaking and listening as part of what we mean by literacy development, and that in and of itself is amazing. So I'll just say in three very significant ways, I think the standards are going to shift the way classrooms work. The beacon of number one importance in terms of what we're all angling for as teachers, as administrators, as school-based leaders, and as parents is independence, that the Common Core standards are really highlighting independent reading, independent writing, independence in creating speaking and listening opportunities for ourselves, and independence in language use. The second thing that's really highlighted and really important in terms of what the components of the Common Core offer to us is this idea of critical thinking skills, that it's not just filling in a bubble, but really thinking about your reading life, thinking about your writing experience, how you present an argument so that you are not overwhelmed by what's going on around you in terms of the amount of text. And then number three would be communication, that the Common Core standards are really saying that literacy is about communication. And so it's really not just about the 5-paragraph essay anymore, even though I know we love that 5-paragraph essay. We're also really in very urgent kind of conditions in terms of thinking about all students has a right to use literacy as a communication tool. And I think that's just the most profound thing that the Common Core is saying. And for that reason, in those three ways, building independence, building critical thinking skills, and building our students' capacity for communication. The big idea there is that we all teach literacy, that the math teacher does it, the social studies teacher does it, the science teacher does it. It's not just in the literacy block, but the entire day is about literacy as a foundation. And I think that's really what the Common Core is asking us to do, is to think in really big ways like that. So I would say those are the three pieces that feel really, really important to me, and I think there's a sense of urgency that there hasn't been nearly enough articulation in terms of what's going to happen grade by grade to get our students to be college and career ready. And by career, I include vocational training and any kind of skills that are really going to help that child that's in our classroom right now to become economically empowered. And I think that's the hugest part of the standards, is that we are seeking college and career ready goals. We have a sense of urgency around that we want to make sure all of our kids have access to a great education.
I think that's the most concise definition of literacy and Common Core I've heard so far.
Thank you.
I'm inspired.
Really,
I'm ready to go teach. Those are wonderful, a wonderful way to describe what's at stake and why we're doing this. Let's move on to another discussion, because I know we struggle today with filling in the implementation gap between what we're currently teaching and what we need to change. Can you chat a little bit about filling that implementation gap and that transition?
I really think this is a critical moment, and the implementation is going to rely on really good leadership. And I don't mean just the administrator, I mean the teachers too, and families really taking ownership for what gaps exist. We have this really idealized view that schools have to be perfect and that people have always been doing everything just right. I don't want administrators or families to get rattled and start blaming each other. This is the opportunity to really act like leaders. And no matter if you're the first grade teacher in the school, the parent who's coming to drop your kid off, or the administrative superintendent, we really have to all own the gaps and just say, one, the world is changing. 2 years ago, the world was completely different. And so in these ways, we really have to honor the gap as not a criticism of ourselves, but actually an opportunity. One last thing about why there are an inevitable gap is that we're also using writing in really new ways. Facebook did not exist a decade ago, nor did Twitter, nor did YouTube. So use the opportunity to fill the gap without being defensive. And I think that's really important. I have 8 shifts that I present that I think really help us look at how we can say, well, where are the gaps and how am I going to fill them? So one is, are we really thinking about the balance between literary and informational text? That is a huge part of the Common Core, is that our students can no longer just be reading a whole class novel. They really have to be thinking in terms of diversity of genre, especially informational text, because they're reading so much of that outside of school and in their content areas. The shift 2 is what I'm looking at as this idea of knowledge building in the content areas. In the content areas, we're also still learning to read and learning to write. So it's not just about building knowledge, but it's about using literacy to build knowledge. My shift 3 is the staircase of complexity. And I think part of the issue for us is always the struggle of really understanding where our students are along this idea of text complexity. Are they able to manage difficult text or challenging text? And they have to read at their independent reading levels in order to get to different complexity levels. So we have to know who our students are as readers, and we have to know who our students are as writers, and who they are as speakers and listeners, so that we can take them up the staircase of complexity, so that we're not randomly just saying, oh, I think Sarah reads at this level, but we really know what level she reads at. Shift 4, one of the real prominent items in the Common Core, which is getting people very nervous, and I just want to reassure everyone listening that we shouldn't be nervous to try this out, and also it's things that you've been doing already, and that is this idea of close reading, of depending on the text to look for solutions or to look for what you're seeking, to find answers to your questions through text. The reason that Google is so successful is because it's helping people think about crafting questions that will get them to the text that they want to find their answers. And that's, relying on the reader, it's relying on the writer, and it definitely takes practice. Close reading is something we can be doing at faculty meetings together. We can be doing webinars together around those with people coming in virtually like myself to actually do a demonstration on a close reading, or other colleagues in your school community who actually really are very good at it, or really keeping your eye out for children who happen to be really good at it, because even the youngest children are really good at reading closely, and I think we almost lose that as we get everyone kind of gets into a mad rush as we get older. And then shift 5 is this idea of writing from sources, and that's huge in the Common Core, is what is the evidence and how we create arguments for our own ideas. And that goes again to that idea about curriculum and assessment, that we are both always building lessons that feel really rich and vibrant, but at the same time, we really want to be inspiring our students to write independently, write from sources they're finding, wherever they're finding their sources, but that those sources are valid. That's a really big shift, as opposed to, I'm going to write a book report and I might quote one person because that's who I read about. But now let's really have even our youngest students go to primary sources and secondary sources, explore the richness of that research. Shift 6 is this idea of focusing on academic vocabulary, and that has always been taught in isolation, and that's where we kind of get to the structures piece, that we need to really build in opportunities for our students to be working independently, to be working in pairs, to be working one-on-one with you, because academic vocabulary, kids are also at very different levels of science and social studies especially. That vocabulary is very, very challenging, and those are areas where I think we've been a little bit remiss. We haven't really said, who are our students as readers of nonfiction, readers of history? And then shift 7, I call this idea of technology-based genres of text. We need to really advocate for getting technology into our classrooms. It's not an option anymore. And when I go around to schools, my heart breaks when teachers say, we didn't have the money to get this. It's going to give access to people from all over the world to be in contact with us and us with them, and it's just liberating. But at the same time, technology can be very cold and very heartless, and that, actually the number 2 pencil is a technology too. It's just a tool, and so the shift is really not just buying a smart board, not just buying a laptop or buying some kind of mobile device, but what are you actually doing with them? And that's that idea of authentic, meaningful use of media and technology that's very explicit in the Common Core. That's a shift, and that's something that we need to put on our checklist. And then the final shift, in my perspective, in terms of the gap, the building of spaces between our gaps, is that we really, truly have to create, and this is a real call to action, it's the hardest thing we'll ever do, and that is to create the student-centered classroom, that we really don't have to be frontal anymore. Our kids are going to go home and get tons of information online. They really don't need us to be standing in front of the classroom. What they really need is for us to be side by side with them, coaching them, mentoring them. Let them watch an amazing video of the poet, Naomi Nye, or great author Judy Blume. There's so much online, and have them come into class to discuss those authors and what they're thinking and what they're feeling and what they're talking about, rather than spending the entire class period having us explaining text we can actually be working side by side with our students. And so that's the biggest shift, and for administrators to do walkthroughs, for teachers to really examine their own teaching styles and to videotape themselves and to talk in faculty meetings and to be really honest. What percentage of the day am I talking versus what percentage of the day are my students talking? We have to be really honest with ourselves, not be afraid of the gaps, and really just embrace the change. So that's my call to action, and that's really what I see in terms of the gap filling.
Wow, what a great set of suggestions. Well, sadly, our time is almost gone, so I'm going to conclude by just asking one quick question. Can you give us just a handful of recommendations that to sort of leave teachers with ideas for what they can do immediately to begin to help bring lower performing students into this world?
Absolutely, and it's such an important question, and I'll just say maybe just 3 tips. So one is that and this is, very broad, the first one, but it's probably the most important one, and that is affirmation, that when you see your students, especially your struggling students, when you see them reaching even the smallest Common Core step on that staircase, to stop everything and to say, I see what you just did. You read a harder page, you did a close reading, you made a case for something you were writing about, and, you went on to a second page in your thinking. Those are all affirmations and opportunities for affirmation. So that's one. 2 is to create opportunities for small group instruction, that we can't teach whole class anymore, and to use technology like all the free tools that are out there, including some of the tools that allow us to communicate and confer with our students as writers online so that they're not necessarily being seen publicly, but they're getting our one-to-one attention. And then number 3 is lots of opportunities for modeled thinking, so that you're thinking in front of your students. You might be reading aloud from a great children's book and then stop and say, I want you guys to turn and talk, to share what I just noted, or to try out what I just did as a close reader, and have them do that for 2 minutes and pair them with you in a whole class instruction in a way that they can turn and talk to the person beside them rather than the whole group, because it gives them an opportunity to strengthen their speaking and listening skills too. So those are my quick suggestions. I know that these are our most challenging students. I believe the Common Core is for them too, and to help us to have higher expectations for all students, but that we want to keep our classrooms as humane and as loving and as affirmational as possible, because at the end of the day, that's really going to help all of our students get to the top of that staircase.
How wonderful. Those are some suggestions that every teacher who's listening today can walk away with immediately. So thank you so much. That's all the time we have today. Pam, I just want to personally thank you for all this information that you have shared. I'm inspired, and I'm sure our audience is as well. I'd like to invite everyone to stay tuned for our top 3 you should know facts about literacy and the Common Core. We also want to point out that Pam has a new book called Be Core Ready through our sponsor Pearson. I think after this discussion, you can see that Pam has much more to share than we have time for here. And I'd also like to ask our audience, if you want to talk to us, share your thoughts, give us feedback, suggest topics you'd like us to see covered in the future, please feel free to email us at WATcast@WeAreTeachers.com.